She was face down in the gray dust of Keth-9 for 40 seconds before she moved. The first movement was her right hand, pressing flat against the ground, pushing. Then her head came up, then her shoulders. She got one knee under her, then the other. And then she was kneeling in the ash and the settling dust, with her cracked ribs screaming and her burned back sending messages that she was not currently accepting. And she looked at the crater where the keeper had been, and it was gone. Not retreated, not dormant. Gone. Burned clean. Nothing remaining. Not a fragment of organic tissue. Not a piece of stolen armor. Not a single piece of anything that had been alive 200 years ago, when it had killed everything sent against it, and then gone to sleep in the rock, and waited. Dara sat back on her heels and breathed for a while. Then she said through the calm, "What is my back reading?" Varos made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a scream. Commander Ithael arrived first, crossing the gray ground in long, bounding strides. And when he reached her, he put one hand on her arm, and she was grateful for it, even though she did not say so. He looked at her burned armor, and said nothing for a moment, and then he said, very quietly, "You came up short." "I know," she said. "I told you 40 meters." "I know," she said again, and her voice was the same as always, flat, simple, a little tired, and somehow that was worse than if she had sounded frightened. He helped her stand. The recovery shuttle from the undying memory reached them in 40 minutes, and Dara spent the ride back unconscious in a way that the medics said was the body's own choice, and not something to be alarmed about, though they were alarmed. Third-degree burns across her upper back, a shattered left forearm from the final blast impact, 2 cracked ribs from the earlier fight, a ruptured eardrum on the right side, and enough bruising across the rest of her that the medical officer asked twice if there were any injuries she might have forgotten to mention. She spent 6 weeks in the Coalition medical bay aboard the Undying Memory. She complained about the food from day 2 onward. She asked for reading material on day 3 and worked through everything in the ship's library that she had not already read. She asked the medical officer daily whether she could begin light exercise, and was told daily that she could not. And she began light exercise on day 9 anyway, and was lectured extensively, and continued anyway. She was, by the assessment of every medical staff member aboard the vessel, the most difficult patient any of them had ever dealt with, and the healthiest recovery they had ever seen. The Coalition held its formal inquiries 6 weeks after the event, in a large formal chamber on the Sarathi homeworld, a tall stone room with high windows and 30 seats at the long curved table, and the kind of light that was designed to make the people sitting under it feel small and accountable. Representatives from 12 species sat along the table, 3 senior admirals, 2 Coalition oversight directors, various advisors, and secretaries and assistants who lined the walls. The official stated purpose of the inquiry was to review and document the events on Keth-9 for the Coalition historical record. The unofficial purpose, which everyone in the room understood and no one said directly, was to figure out what exactly had happened and whether it was something they needed to be frightened of. Professor Varos presented first. He stood at the front of the room for 2.5 hours and walked the panel through his 300-page technical analysis of the engagement, the adaptation cycle data, the shot-by-shot records, the biological breakdown of how the plasma core had disrupted the Keeper's internal systems at their most vulnerable point. He was precise and thorough, and he used many long words and several detailed diagrams. And when he finished, the room was very full of information. Then Dara was asked to present. She stood at the front of the room in her dress uniform, which she had ironed once and badly, and looked at the long table of admirals and directors and advisors, and said, "I got hit, and I didn't stop, and I kept asking questions instead of just hitting harder. That's it. There was a very long silence. One of the admirals, a very old Sarathi, with white feathers and an expression like ancient stone, leaned forward and said, "Staff Sergeant, 10,000 trained soldiers of the highest caliber failed to destroy this organism, and you succeeded, alone, with a standard-issue rifle and an emergency power cell. Can you tell this panel why?" She actually thought about it, standing there in her badly ironed uniform, in a way that made the room wait and not mind waiting. "The 10,000 soldiers were trying to win," she said. "I was trying to learn. Those are different things, and against something that adapts, learning beats winning every time. Because if you learn enough, you stop needing to win. The answer just shows up." The admirals conferred in low voices. One of them looked at Veros. "Professor, your assessment?" Veros stood. He held his notes but did not look at them. He had read his final conclusions so many times in the past 6 weeks that it had become part of him, the way important things do when you carry them long enough. "In 2 centuries of encounter records," he said, "no organism, soldier, machine, or weapon system caused the Keeper to hesitate. It adapted to everything it faced in real time and moved on without pause." He paused himself, letting that sit. "Staff Sergeant Voss caused it to hesitate 11 times over the course of one engagement." He looked at the table, at the panel, at the 30 faces looking back at him. "I believe it hesitated because it encountered something it had no category for. A combatant who was afraid, who knew she was afraid, and who continued anyway, methodically, without aggression and without retreat, gathering information that it had no framework to prevent." He folded his notes. "This species does not lack fear. They appear to have simply made a different arrangement with it, an arrangement I do not fully understand, but which I intend to spend the rest of my career studying." The room stayed quiet for a long time after that. The inquiry concluded. The record was sealed. Commendations were issued through the appropriate channels. Dara received hers in the mail, read it, put it in a drawer, and went back to whatever she had been doing. Years passed. He had always taught alongside his research, but now he taught more, and differently, and in rooms that were always full, because word had gotten around that his lectures were not like other lectures. He had a new course, Xenobiological Threat Response, a new framework, and it was taken by students of 14 different species from 8 different star systems, packed into a hall that was too small for them, but nobody minded. On the last day of the semester, he always did the same thing. He stood at the front of the room and tapped the wall behind him, and a single image came up. A photograph taken from orbit, from a sensor sweep done the day after the engagement. It showed the gray surface of Keth 9, the long scorched crater, and next to the crater, pressed into the dust near the edge where she had slid and stopped, a single boot print, clear and sharp, even from orbit, preserved perfectly, because there was no wind and no weather on Keth 9 to disturb it. He looked at the image for a moment before he spoke, the way he always did. Then he turned to the room full of students and said, "The lesson is not that humans are invincible. They are not, and she would be the first to tell you so. The lesson is that they are the only known species to have looked at a thing that kills everything, and asked how long it takes between killing attempts." He tapped the image one more time. "This will be on the exam. And in a drawer somewhere, in a room somewhere, in a ship or a base or a transit station between stars, a small piece of old folded paper sat in the dark, next to a commendation that had never been framed, and on that paper were 8 lines of handwriting that together said one simple thing, if you knew how to read them. They said, 'I was here, and it was hard, and I stayed anyway.' That was all. The plan was simple, and that was the most dangerous thing about it. Not dangerous to Dara, well, yes, dangerous to Dara, but dangerous in the way that really good plans are dangerous, which is to say that once you heard it, you could see exactly how it would work. And once you could see how it would work, you could also see clearly what it was going to cost. She explained it through the comm, in short flat sentences, while crouched behind her boulder, keeping one eye on the keeper, and her finger resting lightly near her trigger. Not on it, near it, the way experienced soldiers do when they are thinking and not yet acting. Every coalition shuttle carried an emergency plasma core, a dense power cell buried at the back of the engine housing, designed to detonate as a last resort beacon signal if the ship went down in deep space with no other way to call for rescue. It had never been designed as a weapon, never classified as a weapon, never used as a weapon in any record anywhere in the Coalition database. It was emergency equipment, rescue equipment, a device for saving lives, not ending them. And that was exactly why it would work. The Keeper's threat detection system had been built from 2 centuries of recorded Coalition warfare. It had learned every weapon, every charge type, every tactical device, every explosive in the Sarathi military inventory. It had absorbed all of it in the 41 seconds of the old battle before the last soldier fell. Its threat detection was perfect for things it recognized. A plasma core sitting inert inside a dead shuttle was not a weapon. It was not transmitting a weapon signal. It would not read as a weapon to any sensor the Keeper was using, because no sensor the Keeper was using had any reason to look for it. "We get the core out of the shuttle," Dara said. "We get it to me. I plant it inside the joint seam on the left flank. The original seam, the one I have been working all evening, at the point in its adaptation cycle when the seam is open. The blast radius at full detonation of a shuttle core is 40 meters. There was silence on the comm. "You will be inside 40 meters, Varas said. "I will be running," Dara said. More silence. Varas said, and his voice was very careful, the way a person's voice gets when they are trying very hard not to say what they actually want to say. "The blast radius at full detonation is 40 meters. A human running in reduced gravity across broken terrain will cover at best 30 meters in the detonation window." "I will be running fast," Dara said. Commander Ithal's voice came through the channel, sharp, clipped, no extra words. "There is no version of this plan where you are not caught in the blast." Dara said nothing for a moment. Outside the shuttle, across the gray ground, the Keeper had stopped moving toward her. It had paused, the way an adaptive organism pauses when its target stops giving it data to respond to. And it was doing something slow and internal, reorganizing or recalibrating, or simply waiting, and she was using that pause to rest and breathe and think. Then she reached inside the front chest pocket of her field armor and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was old paper, actual physical paper, the kind that nobody used anymore, folded into a small square and worn soft at the creases from being folded and unfolded many times. She opened it and held it in one hand in the vacuum, which could not hurt paper that had no air to need. It was a list, handwritten, short lines, 8 entries. She pressed the comm and spoke. "I am going to read you something," she said. "This is not the time for," Ithal began. "Voss Station, Year 12, crawler accident, 18-meter fall, 3 broken vertebrae, back on post in 11 weeks. She read it in the same flat tone she used for everything. "Dareth 4, Year 14, chemical exposure, full decontamination, declared unfit for active duty, returned to active duty in 9 weeks. Battle of the Mouth, Year 16, gunshot to the left leg and right arm, field surgery with no anesthetic, walked out of the medical tent the next morning." She kept going, line by line, all 8 entries, reading each one like it was a grocery list, and not a record of 8 times she should have stopped, and did not. When she finished reading, she refolded the paper and put it back in her pocket. I have done worse than 40 meters, she said simply. The comm was silent for a long moment. Then Varos said, I will get the core out of the shuttle. No, Ithael said, but he said it differently this time. Not a refusal, but a reassignment. I will get the core out of the shuttle. You keep tracking the adaptation cycles and tell her the exact moment the left seam opens. Varos pulled up his records with shaking hands and did the timing calculations. The seam on the Keeper's left flank had opened and closed 4 times now in the pattern Dara had worked out of it. It opened for roughly 90 seconds at a time, on a cycle of 8 minutes, because the creature was using the downtime to reinforce the front of its body, where Ithael's guards had been making noise. The next open window would be in 6 minutes. Ithael and one of the guards moved through the tilted shuttle to the damaged engine housing at the back. The plasma core was a dense, dark cylinder, the length of a forearm, warm to the touch, even through armor, sealed in a release housing that required a specific sequence to open, and Ithael did not know the sequence. Pilot, Dara said through the comm, tell him the release sequence. The dazed pilot told him the sequence. Ithael removed the core in 90 seconds, with the focused efficiency of a soldier doing the one thing he was good at, in a situation he did not enjoy. He carried it out the shuttle door and across the gray ground to Dara's position, moving low, moving fast, staying out of the Keeper's direct angle, and he placed it in her hands without a word. He looked at her for a moment, the look of one soldier to another, across all the differences of species and history and pride. And then he moved back toward the shuttle. 4 minutes to the open window, Varos said. Dara checked the core's detonation trigger, a simple pressure release, standard across all shuttle models, designed to be operated even by someone with injured hands. She checked it 3 times. She breathed. Her ribs hurt. Her shoulder hurt. She breathed anyway. 2 minutes. She began moving toward the Keeper, slowly at first, using the same approach angles she had been using for the past hour, moving in the patterns it had already logged and categorized and decided were non-critical. She was not a new threat from a new direction. She was the same small creature doing the same repetitive thing she had been doing all evening. And the Keeper's attention stayed distributed, watching the shuttle, watching Ithael moving in the background, watching the guards, watching everything at once, and therefore not watching her specifically. 30 seconds. The seam is beginning to open. Dara moved faster, closed the distance from 20 meters to 10 meters to 6 meters in 3 hard sprinting movements. And the Keeper turned toward her, because at 6 meters, something in its threat assessment shifted, and it registered her as close, as immediate, as a priority. And the seam on its left flank opened. She drove the core into it with both hands, pushed it deep into the gap between organic and mechanical tissue, and hit the trigger. And she ran. She ran harder than she had run in her life, across broken gray rock in low gravity. Meant her strides were long, but her push-off was weak, and the ground kept trying to bounce her upward instead of forward. And she counted the seconds in her head the way she always counted, 1 and 2 and 3. The blast caught her at 28 meters. It picked her up and threw her forward, and she hit the ground face down and slid across the gray dust and did not move. The Keeper detonated from the inside, not slowly, not in stages, all at once, a single enormous bloom of white light in the dark silence of the airless moon, and the shockwave rolled outward across the surface, and the dust rose in a great silent wave, and the stars looked down at all of it, without comment. And where the Keeper had stood, there was nothing, just a scorched crater, and drifting smoke and the gray dust of Keth 9 settling back down over everything, the way dust always does. The first shot did not kill it. Dara had not expected it to. She had come in low, moving fast across the broken gray ground, keeping her body close to the uneven surface, using the ridges and the craters and the old split rocks as cover. She was not charging. She was not stupid enough to charge. She was moving in controlled short bursts, stopping, dropping, firing, and moving again, the way she had been trained, the way her body had learned to move before her brain had fully decided what to do. The keeper saw her immediately. Everything saw her immediately. She was the only warm and moving thing on the surface of this dead moon, and it had just locked onto this shuttle, full of warm moving things. But she was closer and louder and more present, and so it turned its full attention toward her. And all of that attention was a heavy and terrible thing to have pointed in your direction. She fired at the left side of its body, specifically at a joint she had noticed while watching it approach the shuttle, a place where the organic tissue met the mechanical section, where the two materials came together in a visible seam that looked slightly different from the rest of its surface. She fired 3 shots fast at that seam, and she saw them connect, saw the creature flinch, not stumble, not fall, just flinch, a small, tight movement of pain or recognition. And then she was already moving, rolling left behind a boulder before it could respond. A section of its body extended outward and fired a pulse of compressed force in her direction. The same type of weapon the Sarathi soldiers had used against it 200 years ago, copied and stored and reused. And it hit the boulder she was hiding behind, and the boulder cracked in half. She was already 3 meters away, flat on the ground. She fired again at the same seam. 3 more shots, same angle, same speed. The keeper flinched again, and this time it began to adapt. She could see it happening. The seam started to close, new tissue forming over the joint, thickening, hardening, and by shot number 6, the seam was sealed and her shots were bouncing off a surface that had not existed 4 minutes ago. She stopped firing at that spot. She moved her aim to a second location, a point near the top of its body where 2 of the mechanical sections met in a cluster of dark connectors, and she fired 4 shots there instead. It adapted again, faster this time. She moved to a third point, lower, near what she was beginning to think of as its right knee, though calling it a knee was generous, and fired again. And so it went, shot, adapt, move, shot, adapt, move, Dara working her way through its surface like she was reading a map, marking every location, measuring every response time, noting which areas it sealed fastest and which areas it was slower to protect. She was not trying to fight it the way soldiers fight. She was doing something that looked to anyone watching like a very strange and dangerous kind of science experiment. Inside the crashed shuttle, Professor Varos was pressed against the cracked front window, with his display in 3 of his 6 hands, and his eyes wide open, and his mouth making small quiet sounds of complete disbelief. He was watching and recording everything, the shot locations, the adaptation speeds, the creature's response patterns, and he was beginning to understand what Dara was doing, in a way that made his scientific heart beat very fast. "She is mapping it," he said. Commander Ithales stood behind him. "She is going to get killed," he said. "She is mapping it," Varos said again, louder, because he needed to say it twice to believe it. Every soldier who ever faced this creature died within minutes. They hit it, it adapted. They hit harder, it adapted again, and they died before they could learn anything. But she is not trying to hit harder. She is staying alive long enough to collect data. She is generating the information that 10,000 soldiers never lived to collect. That is a strategy. For a human, Varos said very quietly, I think that might be the strategy. Outside on the gray surface, Dara was hit for the first time in the 23rd minute. She had been moving between 2 large rock formations, and she misjudged the reach of one of the keeper's tendrils. It extended further than she expected and caught her across the left shoulder, and the impact was not a sharp thing, but a heavy blunt force thing, The kind of hit that does not cut, but presses, and it threw her 4 meters sideways, and she hit the ground hard. She lay still for 2 seconds. Then she got up. Her left shoulder plate was cracked from top to bottom, and the arm beneath it ached all the way down to her fingers. But she got up. She checked her rifle was still in her hand, and she fired 2 shots at point number 1, the original seam on the left side of its body, because she had a theory and she needed to test it. They connected, and the seam opened. It had deprioritized that location after sealing it, because the threat there had apparently stopped. The Keeper's adaptation resources were not unlimited. It could not defend everywhere at once, and it had been quietly dropping its guard on old locations to protect new ones. Dara understood it now. The creature was extraordinary. It was the most advanced adaptive organism she had ever faced. But it followed a pattern, and patterns could be learned, and things that could be learned could be used. In the 41st minute she took a second hit, a shockwave burst that she could not fully dodge, catching her across the ribs on her right side, and she felt 2 of them crack, with a clean sharp pain that told her exactly what it was. She pressed through it. She breathed through the pain in short controlled bursts, the way she had been trained, the way she had practiced, in 3 other terrible places, on 3 other terrible days. Varos was crying. She could hear it in his voice, through the comm channel. "Voss, you need to come back. You are injured. Please come back." "I'm fine," she said, and fired 4 shots at point number 2. "You are not fine. Your biometric readings show 2 cracked ribs and I know what I have," she said. "I'm the one with them." She moved behind a ridge, breathed, fired again. "Keep recording. I need you to track the adaptation cycles. How many seconds between when it seals a point and when it drops the seal. Write it all down." Varos wrote it all down. He wrote everything down. His hands were shaking, and his eyes were blurring. But he wrote every number, and every second, and every shot, because he understood now that this data was the most important thing that had ever been collected on this moon. More important than all the records from the old battle. More important than any report he had ever written in 40 years of science. Commander Ithael was no longer standing behind him. He had moved to the shuttle door. He had watched the human woman take 2 heavy hits and get up both times and fire again. And something had changed in him. Something that had nothing to do with pride or strategy. Something much simpler. Something that lived deep in the part of a warrior that recognizes another warrior. Without being asked, without being given an order, he began directing the 2 Sarathi guards to make noise, to fire short bursts from the shuttle doorway, to hit lights, to bang on the damaged hull, anything to split the Keeper's attention, to make it divide its focus, so that the human could keep working. He did not tell anyone he was doing this, because he had thought of it. He said nothing at all. He just did it. In the 59th minute, Dara crouched behind a long, flat boulder, in the gray dust of Keth 9, with cracked ribs, and a hurt shoulder, and a rifle that was down to 30% charge. And she knew exactly how to kill the thing standing 60 meters away from her. She pressed her comm. "Professor," she said. Yes, I am here." Varus's voice came back immediately. "I know what we need to do," she said. "But you are not going to like it." She heard him take a very long breath. "Tell me," he said. The shuttle broke through the thin upper layer of Keth 9's dead sky, if you could even call it a sky, because there was no air and no color, just a dark nothing above a gray surface. And it landed with a soft bump on the moon's cracked ground, and then sat there humming, while its passengers looked out the windows and tried to feel brave. They were not supposed to land. The original mission plan said observation only. Watch from the ship, take readings from above, collect data through long-range sensors, and go home. But the signal coming from beneath the moon's surface had become very strange in the last 12 hours. It was not growing louder exactly, but it was growing more focused. like something underground that had been searching blindly in all directions, had suddenly found a direction it liked. Professor Veros had argued for a surface team. He said the readings from orbit were incomplete. He said the scientific value of ground-level data could not be overstated. Commander Ithael had agreed, not because he wanted more data, but because he was Sarathi, and the Sarathi did not sit in orbit while there was something worth looking at on the ground below them. And Dara had said nothing either way, but she had put on her field armor without being asked, and checked her pulse carbine 3 times before they boarded the shuttle. Now they stood on the surface of Keth 9, 8 of them in total. The professor, the commander, 2 Sarathi guards, 2 coalition science officers, 1 pilot still inside the shuttle, and Dara, and the ground beneath their boots was so still that it felt like standing on the back of something sleeping. The science officers set up their equipment quickly, small sensor towers that pushed into the cracked ground, and began sending readings back to the professor's handheld display. The data came in fast, and it was not good. The signal from below was no longer searching. It had found something, locked onto something, and was now moving upward through the rock, at a speed that should not have been possible for anything traveling through solid stone. "How deep is it?" Ithael asked. "It was 4 kilometers down 40 minutes ago," Varl said, staring at his display. "It is now less than 1. Ithael looked at the ground beneath his feet. Then he looked at the shuttle. "We leave now," he said, and his voice carried the absolute flat certainty of a soldier who knew when a situation had changed. They moved fast back to the shuttle, and the pilot had the engines spinning before they were all the way inside, and the shuttle lifted off the surface of Keth 9 in a hard, straight climb, pushing up and away from the moon with everything it had. And then the ground cracked open. It did not crack in one place. It cracked in 6 places at once, long, deep splits running across the gray surface, like something enormous had decided that the top of the moon was simply in its way. Dust and rock exploded upward in slow, silent clouds. Because there was no air to carry sound, everything that happened on this moon happened in complete silence, which made it worse somehow. And from the largest crack, something came up. It was big. It was wrong. It did not move the way living things moved, and it did not look the way machines looked. It was somewhere in between, and that somewhere was a place that the brain did not want to accept. It had mass and weight, and it moved with a kind of heavy, deliberate confidence, like something that had never once in its existence been given a reason to hurry. Its surface shifted and rearranged as it moved, parts of it folding inward, other parts extending outward. And embedded in its body, fused into it at 100 different points, were pieces of armor. Old armor, 2 centuries old, corroded and gray, Sarathi armor, from the soldiers that had come here 200 years ago and never come back. The Keeper wore its dead like a second skin. Commander Ithael made a sound that he would never admit to making. The shuttle climbed hard and fast, and the Keeper looked up at it. It did not have eyes in any normal sense, but it looked up, the whole mass of it orienting toward the moving shuttle the way a flower turns toward the sun. And then one part of its body extended outward in a long, thick tendril that moved faster than something that size had any right to move. And it clipped the back of the shuttle on the left side, not a full hit, barely a graze. But barely was enough. The shuttle spun. The pilot fought the controls with both hands and all his focus, and managed to turn the spin into a hard diagonal descent instead of a straight drop. But there was no saving the landing. The shuttle hit the ridge 4 kilometers from the crack site at high speed, bounced once, scraped along a long stretch of broken rock, and stopped with its nose buried in a short stone ledge. The inside of the shuttle became very loud for a moment, and then became very quiet. Dara was the first one on her feet. She moved through the tilted interior, checking on each person. The pilot was alive, but dazed. One of the science officers had a cut across her forehead. Ithael was pulling himself upright with his dignity mostly intact. And Varos was sitting against the far wall, with his display still in his hands, still reading data. Because he was the kind of man who collected information even when the ceiling was on an angle. "Comms?" Dara asked the pilot. The pilot tried. He tried 3 frequencies. He shook his head. "Something is blocking the signal," he said. "Local jamming, very strong. I cannot reach the ship." Dara looked out the cracked front window. The keeper was not rushing toward them. It was moving in their direction at a slow, measured pace, covering the gray ground steadily, the fused armor on its body catching the distant starlight. It looked like it was going for a walk. It looked like it had all the time in the world. It had never needed to run after anything. Professor Varos was still reading his display. His 6 hands were all shaking now, but his eyes were focused and sharp. He was reading the old battle records, cross-referencing them with the live sensor data, and his pale face had gone very still in the way that scientists' faces go still when they are looking at something that does not make sense. "It is jamming our communications, using a frequency pattern it learned from the Sarathi battle fleet," he said quietly. 200 years ago, it has not forgotten a single thing it learned in that battle." Commander Ithael straightened his uniform and checked his sidearm. "Then we hold here and we fight," he said. Dara turned from the window and looked at him. "No," she said. Ithael stared at her. "No?" 10,000 of your soldiers fought it, and they all died," she said, without any cruelty in her voice, just flat, simple fact. "Doing the same thing again will not fix that." She looked back out the window at the keeper moving toward them across the gray dust, slow and certain and enormous. "I need you to trust me and stay back and let me try something." "What are you going to try?" Ithael demanded. Dara checked the charge on her pulse carbine. She pulled the strap tight over her shoulder. She looked at Varos. "You said it adapts to weapons in real time," she said, "but it has never fought the same attacker twice, because everyone who ever fought it died too fast to make it fight them again." She moved toward the damaged shuttle door and kicked it open. Cold, dark vacuum poured in, and she sealed her helmet. "So it has never had to deal with someone who keeps getting back up." She stepped out onto the surface of Keth 9, and she walked toward the keeper. And the keeper kept walking toward her. And the gray dust between them was 4 kilometers wide, and the stars above them watched in silence. The research vessel Undying Memory moved slowly through deep space, far away from any planet, far away from any warmth, and the stars outside its windows looked cold and small, like they were watching from a very safe distance, and they were smart to do so. The ship belonged to the Galactic Coalition, which was a group of many alien species who had come together over hundreds of years to share knowledge, trade resources, and try very hard not to go to war with each other. Most of the time. It was a long and beautiful vessel, full of scientists and officers, and equipment that beeped and hummed at all hours. And right now, it was heading somewhere that most of its crew would rather not go. At the front of the main briefing hall, Professor Xylan Varos stood behind a wide glass table and tried to look calm. He was a Thurvian, which meant he had 6 thin arms, pale skin that shimmered slightly in the light, and very large, dark eyes that were currently blinking too fast. He had spent 40 years studying dangerous alien organisms, and he was the greatest expert in the galaxy on something called xenobiological threat classification, which was a very long way of saying he studied things that could kill you and then wrote reports about them. The hall was full. Coalition officers in their dark blue uniforms, 2 Sarathi commanders with feathered crests along their heads sitting near the back with their arms crossed, a handful of scientists hunched over small data tablets, and 1 human sitting near the side wall in a plain gray field uniform, with her boots up on the empty chair beside her. Her name was Staff Sergeant Dara Voss, and she looked bored. She was not a large person. She had short dark hair pressed flat under a field cap, a lean face with tired eyes, and the general energy of someone who had been in too many meetings and not enough action. She was attached to this mission as a security liaison, which was the Coalition's polite way of saying they were nervous and wanted a human nearby in case things went badly, because humans had a reputation. Commander Ithale stood to the left of the professor, tall, silver-feathered, proud, with the posture of someone who had never once in his life been told he was wrong. He was Sarathi, one of the oldest and most respected warrior species in the Coalition, and he had made no secret of the fact that he thought having a human soldier on this mission was unnecessary and slightly embarrassing. Professor Veros tapped the glass table, and a large image appeared in the air above it. A moon, gray and cracked, covered in ancient craters, with no atmosphere and no light except what the stars gave it. It looked dead. It looked like it had been dead for a very long time. "This is Keth 9, the professor said, and his voice was steady, even though his hands were not. 200 years ago, the Sarathi High Command sent a strike force here to deal with a threat that had been detected beneath the surface, an organism, partially biological, partially mechanical, of completely unknown origin." He paused. 10,000 soldiers went down to that moon. The room was very quiet. None of them came back. He pressed a second button, and a recorded battle began to play in the air above the table. Old, grainy footage from 2 centuries ago, showing Sarathi soldiers in heavy armor charging across the gray surface of the moon, firing massive weapons, screaming orders, and then something rising from the ground. Something enormous and dark and wrong-shaped, moving through them like they were made of paper. It wore pieces of their armor on its body. It had taken the armor from the soldiers it had already killed, and added it to itself, not as a trophy, but as armor of its own. The creature had no name in any language. The Coalition had catalogued it under the designation the Keeper, because it seemed to keep everything it had ever encountered, every weapon, every tactic, every wound, and it learned from all of it, instantly, automatically, without ever needing to stop and think. It adapted in real time. A weapon that hurt it once would never hurt it the same way again. A strategy that worked for 10 seconds would be countered before the 11th second arrived. And it had been dormant for 200 years, sitting beneath the surface of Keth 9, doing nothing, going nowhere, until 3 days ago, when a deep seismic event had cracked the moon's lower crust, and something inside had started sending out a signal. The Coalition had sent the undying memory to observe. They were very clear about this. Professor Veros finished his briefing and opened the floor for questions. Several officers asked about equipment and protocols and evacuation timelines. Commander Ithale asked nothing because he already considered himself fully informed. And then Dara Voss lowered her boots from the chair, sat up straight, and raised one hand. The professor looked at her with mild surprise, not because she had raised her hand, but because of what she asked. "How long does it take to adapt," she said, "between one attack and the next?" The professor stared at her. He opened his mouth. He closed it again. He looked at his records. 40 years of records, thousands of documents, hundreds of second-hand accounts from Sarathi survivors of other smaller encounters. That data was never collected," he said quietly. Dara nodded slowly. "Second question. Did all 10,000 soldiers attack at the same time?" Veros checked. He already knew the answer, but he checked anyway, because something in the way she asked made him feel like the answer mattered more than he had ever realized. "Yes," he said. "Full force, full assault, standard military doctrine, overwhelming numbers, maximum firepower, all at once." Dara nodded again, that same slow, thoughtful nod, and then she said nothing more. She leaned back in her seat and looked at the image of Keth 9 floating in the air, and her expression was the expression of someone who had just been handed a puzzle and already had a feeling about the answer. Commander Ethael leaned toward his second officer and said in a low voice that was not quite low enough, "Primitive tactical instinct. The humans are always looking for patterns in things they do not understand." His second officer nodded in agreement. She kept looking at the moon, and the moon kept drifting closer outside the window, gray and silent, as the undying memory slowed its engines and moved into observation position. And somewhere beneath all that dead rock and dust, something that had not moved in 200 years began, very quietly, to stir.